Chapter 3. Take people who know how to avenge themselves, or, generally, how to stand up for themselves. How do they do it? If, let us say, they are seized with feelings of revenge, nothing exists within them at the moment except those feelings. Such a man will push on straight towards his goal like a raging bull with lowered horns, and only a wall might stop him. Incidentally, before a wall, such gentry, that is, simple, direct people and men of action, will sincerely give up. To them, a wall is not a means of evasion as it would, for instance, be to us, people who think and hence do nothing. Not a pretext for turning back, a pretext we ourselves don't know, as a rule, believe in, but always welcome. No, they'll stop before a wall in all sincerity. A wall to them is something calming, final, morally absolving, something perhaps even mystical, but more about walls later. Well then, in my view, such a direct, simple man is the true, moral human being, the kind of human being that tender Mother Nature herself had hoped to see when she was lovingly creating him on earth. I envy such a man to the point of loathing. He is stupid, I admit, but perhaps a normal man should be stupid. How do we know? Perhaps it's even very beautiful that way. And what particularly confirms me in this, if I might call it so, suspicion, is that if you take, for example, the antithesis of the normal man, that is, a man of heightened consciousness who has surely emerged not from the lap of nature but from a retort. This is almost mystical, gentlemen, but I suspect that too. This retort man often gives up so completely in the face of his antithesis that he honestly feels himself, with all of his heightened consciousness, to be a mouse and not a man. He may be an acutely conscious mouse, but a mouse all the same, while the other is a man, and consequently, and so on and so forth. And the main thing, again, is that it's he himself, who considers himself a mouse. Nobody else asks him to, and that is the important point. Let's take a look now at this mouse in action. Let's suppose, for example, that it has also been mistreated, and it is almost always mistreated, and also longs to avenge itself. It will have more pent-up bitterness, perhaps, than l'homme de nature de la vie vite, a nasty, mean little desire to repay the offender in the same coin may be rankling within it even more vilely than in l'homme de nature de la vie vite. Because l'homme de nature de vie vite, in his innate stupidity, views his revenge as no more than a matter of simple justice. But the mouse, with its heightened sensibility, denies all idea of justice as regards to the situation. And finally, we come to the deed itself, to the act of revenge. The wretched mouse has, in addition to its first vileness, already managed to hedge itself around with a host of other vileness in the form of questions and doubts. It has added to the one initial question so many other unresolved questions that, willy-nilly, it will be caught up in a fatal morass, a stinking mess consisting of its own doubts and agitations, and, finally, of the spittle that rains upon it from the mouths of the direct men of action who solemnly stand around it as judges and arbiters, roaring with laughter at it as loudly as their healthy throats permit. Naturally, the only thing that's left to it is to shrug its little shoulders at the whole business in sheer disgust, slip back ignominiously into its hole with a smile of feigned contempt in which it doesn't itself believe. And there, in its loathsome, stinking underground hole, our mouse, insulted, crushed, destroyed by ridicule, immediately settles into cold, venomous, and worse of it all, lifelong malice. For 40 years on end it will recall its humiliation, to the last and most shameful detail, each time embellishing the recollection with still more shameful details, spitefully teasing and whipping itself up into its own fantasies. It will be ashamed of its fantasies, and yet it will recall and go over everything again and again, piling all sorts of imaginary wrongs upon itself under the pretext that they also could have happened, and never forgiving anything. It may even begin to avenge itself, but somehow in fits and starts, in trivialities, from behind the stove, as it were, incognito, without faith either in its right to vengeance or in its possible success, and knowing in advance that all of its attempts will make it suffer 100 times more than the object of its vengeance, who may, for all you know, pay less attention to it than a flea bite. Why, on its own very deathbed, the mouse will remember everything again, with all the interest accrued throughout the years, But it's precisely in this cold, loathsome, half-despair, half-belief, in this deliberate burying of yourself underground for 40 years out of sheer pain, in this assiduously constructed and yet somewhat dubious helplessness, in all of this poison of unfulfilled desires turned inward, this fever of vacillations, of resolutions adopted for eternity, and of repentances a moment later that you find the very essence of that strange, sharp pleasure that I spoke about. It is so subtle, so elusive, so difficult to grasp that people with the slightest limitations, or even simply those with strong nerves, will not be able to understand an iota of it. And perhaps, you may add with a smirk, it will not be understood by those who have never been slapped either, thus politely hinting to me that I might have had the experience in my lifetime of being slapped, and therefore speak as an expert. I'll wager that you're thinking this, but calm yourselves, gentlemen. I have not been slapped, although it is absolutely of no concern to me what you may or may not think about it. In fact, I may even regret that I have not distributed enough slaps myself in this lifetime. But enough of that. Not another word about this subject, which is of such inordinate interest to you. I will continue calmly about people with strong nerves, who do not understand certain refinements of pleasure. Although these gentry may, on certain occasions, let us say, bellow like oxen at the top of their lungs, and although this is perhaps greatly to their honor, yet, as I have said before, they instantly give up in the face of impossibility. Is impossibility, then, a stone wall? What kind of a stone wall? Well, of course, the laws of nature, the conclusions of the natural sciences, mathematics. If people prove to you, for example, that you're descended from an ape, there is no point in making a sour face about it. Accept it as it is. If they will prove to you that, when you come down to it, one drop of your own fat is bound to be more precious to you than the lives of 100,000 fellow humans, and that this will in the end determine all the so-called virtues and duties and all the rest of that rotten nonsense, you have no choice but to accept it. There's nothing to be done about it because 2 times 2 is mathematics. Try and object to that. For goodness sake, they'll cry, you cannot argue against it. 2 times 2 is 4. Nature doesn't consult you. It doesn't give a damn about your wishes or whether its laws please or do not please you. You must accept it as it is, and hence accept all consequences. A wall is indeed a wall. And so on and so forth. Good God, what do I care about the laws of nature and arithmetic if, for one reason or another, I don't like these laws, including the 2 times 2 is 4? Of course, I cannot break through this wall with my head if I don't have enough strength to break through it. But neither will I accept it simply because I face a stone wall and am not strong enough. As though such a stone wall were indeed a soothing element, and really contained within itself even the slightest reason for making peace with it, solely because it means that 2 times 2 is 4. Oh, absurdity of absurdities! But how preferable is it to understand everything, to be aware of everything, of all impossibilities and stone walls, and yet refuse to reconcile with yourself to a single one of those impossibilities and walls if it sickens you to submit to them. How preferable to reach, by the most fruitable, logical combinations, the most revolting conclusions on the eternal subject that you are somehow to blame even for the stone wall, although, again, it is entirely obvious that you are not to blame at all, and, in consequence of that, to sink into voluptuous inertia, silently and impotently grinding your teeth and wallowing in the idea that, as it turns out, you didn't even have anyone to rail at, that you can't find any object of blame and may never find one, that all of this is some sort of sleight of hand, a sharpener's trick, a swindle, a plain mess in which it is impossible to tell who's who or what's what. And yet, despite all the uncertainties and confusions, you are still in pain, and the more uncertainty, the more pain.